My name's Paul from S.H.A.K.E and this video is a process outline of how Bottom Liners Volume 1 was made, a sample pack focusing on bass guitar loops with audio and MIDI to give options to producers making music in a variety of styles. My starting point for making this sample pack was firstly just picking music that I like, so all of the subfolders in the sample pack I like, listen and grew up with, so that was the starting point of actually needing to like it. And then the second point was just thinking around those styles of music that use a lot of synthesized bass, 808s are quite prominent, and maybe every now and again you hear a bit of bass guitar sort of like sprinkled in, maybe for a section or a chorus or a particular lick. I'm thinking, if I gave that style of music more bass guitar options, could it give producers which make that different ways of approaching their track, so as to create something which maybe they don't have a common access to? And with wanting to make it as usable as possible, my approach to it was creating chord progressions or going through my samples just to create a loop. So I've got to beat with sample and drums, and then with that putting the bass line on top of it. So making sure that I've got that good grounding to making sure I've got something with a great feel, because I didn't want to just create a bass line without reacting to anything, because I'm not too sure how well that would fit. So I wanted it to make it to fit to a beat, but then also I was consciously thinking of the types of samples and chord progressions that I was creating, in that, so with the melodic and harmonic side, I wanted to think, okay, what kind of progressions am I hearing quite commonly in these particular styles of music? And I wanted those progressions to be similar to that. So I suppose, talking about it in a YouTube online producer way, the harmonic melodic aspects were like type beats. So once I had the type beat foundation, then I put my bass line on it, as if I'm times that I've done session bass line work, and with that it's a bit more free form. I'm putting my personality, my sort of like ears to it, so the combination of the type beat foundation and my personal twist on it gives something which is fit for purpose but with a little bit of flavor as well. And just so you know how it was being recorded, just in my very humble home studio, being a box room, which you're seeing the best part. If you were to see the rest of it, you'd think, how am I working in here? It's absolute madness. But within the madness that I've got in my humble space, I've got a pretty nice preamp going into my interface. So I'll show you those now, just so you get an idea about how the sounds were actually recorded. So here's where it all starts on my instrument, the American 2011 Fender P-Bass with a Seymour Duncan pickup, which sounds really, really nice. I plug the bass directly into this preamp, which is the front end for all of my recording, go straight into the instrument inputs, really smooth preamps, and the noise level is really low. And then after that into my RME Babyface interface, it goes in there through the balanced inputs just to make sure that the noise level is really low and the quality is maintained throughout the signal chain. So just as a working example, let's look at labeled on the sample pack, I called it Fantastic Slammage, and it's under the hip hop section. So here's the beat. So as a beat, I created that just to get the right feel of it. And if we just take away the actual beat, so if we hear the bass line in isolation, how you hear it on the pack, this is what it sounds like. So that's where we got to. But just to break it down a bit more about getting to that point. So firstly, of creating a beat, because I wanted to make sure that whatever I made did fit, really, and it wasn't just a random bass line. So with that, my starting point was just creating a chord progression, I've just used the plug-in scaler, really sort of like common. So I took one of the progressions and I altered it a little bit, just to have a chord progression, and then just went through my endless library of drum loops and found one just to put it together. And this beat actually started off with the drum loop. I found the drum loop, I've listened to it in years, and then I thought, oh, okay, right, that's going to set the tone for it. And then with that, created the chords. So without the bass line, this was how I was working just to actually create the bass line. This was my starting point. And I just listened to this on the loop, and then I was just quite simply trying to play about with different ideas, just improvising, freestyling on my bass until I came across something that stuck. And out of the samples on the sample pack, this was one of the odd ones out, because just to make sure everything was about making it as usable as possible. So this was actually one of the odd ones, which the loop was a 4-bar loop, because on the whole, a lot of music that I'm into revolves around 2 bars and 4 bars. So what I wanted to do with this pack was create 8-bar loops, so it gave producers some variation just to fit all of the different sections in their tune that they may come up with. But when I created this loop, I just thought to myself, it sounds good as a 4-bar, it feels good, so I'm just going to stick with that. So this is like one of the anomalies, but I still think it's quite a good example to go through. So this is a 4-bar loop, and then my starting point was my identifying the actual key. So the key of this one was E minor. So all the chords are really around E minor. So that was my starting point of when I did create the bass line. That's how I would label it, just so it could be of use to producers to mold into whatever key that their actual beat was in. And so I played around with some ideas, and just with the recording side of things of the actual bass line itself, if I just go and just do the raw audio here and just take Melodyne off, because Melodyne calls it to clip at the end. I was really as you can see, level wise, if you look at my channel level, it's really going between it's really peaking at about -12 dB, and that was quite conscious because I wanted to keep it really open, just so you could adapt it however way you wanted it. I didn't want to do lots of processing, and then it's going to mess with gain staging, and then by the time you put your own stuff on there, it sounds really distorted. So this really is open. I didn't do much to this at all, just to give you ultimate flexibility. So that's what I did to the bass line. And then after I played it in, that's when I was late to the party with this plugin, but I definitely couldn't have made a sample pack without it. So this is where Melodyne came in. So I played my bass line, and then once I played my bass line, I put Melodyne on it. And then with that, I transferred the bass line into Melodyne. And as you can see what Melodyne does, I'm using the Studio Editor version 5 with this one. So with breaking down notes, I can also break down polyphonic sound. So if I was playing chords, I could break down chords as well. But of course, the bass line, I'm playing one note at a time. So with that, put the bass line into that. And it's interesting because, Melodyne reads this as A minor, but I kind of go between these discrepancies in one of my other videos to do with the bugs and improvements for the next time round. So I recorded it into there, and then once I did that and I saw what key it was in, this was my starting point for then transposing it to each of the keys. Now, my approach to transposing it, I didn't want to just I wanted it to be able to fit, say, if people are using bass guitar plugins. So I didn't want any of the transpositions to be unnatural. So you'll see here that the lowest note is E. So the lowest note is on the E string of the bass, and I play a 4-string bass, so the lowest note that I can play is E. So when I was transposing, I only went up. I didn't want to go down because it's going lower than what a bass guitar could actually play. So from this point with this bass line, I transposed it each time, a semitone up each time until I covered each 12 keys. And the process for that, I said, it was, you'll see the different tracks here. Quite simply what I did, open Melodyne, I saw that was the key. I went, okay, that's fine. And then I just quite simply soloed the track, bounced it, and then labeled it. And that's basically what I did. And then I went to the next track, same again, but this time I moved up a semitone and then labeled the track. And you'll see the name and convention that I used for this. Firstly was the name of the actual sample, then underscore calling it a bass line, because I'm appreciative you're using many samples, so calling it a bass line, and also putting the BPM in there as well. So that's what I've done. And then it doesn't show up here, but I also put the key in there as well, just so you can go, oh, okay, that's a bass line, it's from that pack, that's the BPM, and that's the key. So all of the information is in the exported audio file as a wave. So I did that each time. New track, Melodyne, dragged it down, dragged it up a semitone, sorry. You know, select all the tracks, select all of the notes, and then drag them up. So a very manual process, but that's what I did. So step by step, I did that for the audio. Then once I did all of the audio, then I went on to the MIDI. And how I approached the MIDI was this. I went back to the very first audio track that I did, and then just in the settings here, save as MIDI, created a MIDI track, and then I exported the MIDI track, and then I imported it back in. I wanted to check its playability. Now, I've got all of the edited versions here, but one thing I found, I'm not too sure if it's a quirk of Melodyne or maybe it's something that I don't quite know, because the first time I used it was for this sample pack. But one thing that I found when I saved MIDI and imported it directly back into the project was it didn't quite line up. It seemed to add a few beats to the end of the actual loop. So I always needed to drag that in. So that was the first point. And then secondly, I noticed that this isn't a Melodyne thing. This is a poor editing thing. When I first started to do a lot of editing, I realized that some of the notes were much longer than I actually played in the MIDI notes, and that's because it was picking up from the ringing out of the bass. So that's why I started off doing this pack not wanting to do any processing at all, but the noise gating was vital, because even though my playing on the whole was pretty clean, it was just to make sure that the length of notes was how I wanted it, and Melodyne didn't pick up how long it thought the notes were, making things longer than they actually were, if that makes sense. So that's how I did that. And then I wanted to make sure on the usability of the actual sounds. So let me just do this. So dragged the MIDI back in and then just picked any preset and then just played it back and then just heard how it sounded. So for this particular one, it didn't require that much editing. The main editing that it did need was I needed to go into all of the notes and raise them up an octave. Because one thing that I found is that the lowest notes, it couldn't play back on this synth bass. So with that, it was just to make this drag and drop so it's easy for people to use. So I needed to go into it initially and just highlight all the notes, then move it up an octave. So that's the only editing that I really needed to do with this particular loop. And you'll see the naming conventions here. Now this was really key with the MIDI part, in that labeling the MIDI tracks with the same level of detail that I label the audio tracks with the same conventions you'll see here. Bass, fantastic slammage, what it's called, the actual key, and the BPM. It's annoyed me in the past when I've used some packs and the audio has been beautifully labeled, but the MIDI has been whatever the working title of their project is, and it's difficult for me to use that and to categorize my category of sounds when it's just got a random sort of name which the original maker of the sample had in their project file. So I made sure that I used the same naming conventions for audio that I did for MIDI. So renaming each of the regions, keeping that consistent, and again exporting that out one by one. The same process what I did with audio, going into the MIDI file, raising it up a semitone, renaming it, exporting it. And that was the process I followed for each one until I had 12 different versions to represent all of the keys. And in the end, that's what created the folder of 12 audio files and 12 MIDI files to eventually get to that point. And that's it. That's the process. Sample pack done after going through all of that. Certain parts of the process are more fun than others, I'm not gonna lie. But ultimately the end product is worth it, because when I did finish it, I was genuinely excited I want to show people this, so it really is worth it in the end. So if there's any thoughts on that, just please drop a comment, it'd be much appreciated. But then also selfishly for me, any Logic dons out there, if you've seen any of my workflow through that video and think, actually Paul, you could have done a bulk edit here, or you could have done a few things at once, help a guy out, send me that shortcut key, because yeah, if I could cut out any of those steps, that would be amazing. If not, I accept it's part of the process and it is what it is. But thanks for taking the time to watch again, and I'll be in touch.